Good evening, I'm Claire Harvey, and welcome to this special live election edition of The Front, the Australian's daily news podcast. Thank you for joining us for this exclusive event for subscribers to The Australian, giving you access to Australia's best journalists and commentators. Tonight, we're in for a real treat. Just days out from the election, I'm joined by The Australian's editor-at-large, Paul Kelly, political editor, Simon Benson, investigations writer, Sharri Markson, and chief political correspondent, Geoff Chambers. We're going to break down the campaign so far and discuss what we might be able to expect on election night. If you'd like to join the conversation, you can submit your question by using the Q&A box, which is on the right-hand side of the screen if you're watching on a desktop, or underneath the video on mobile. Good evening, panellists, and welcome. Thank you for joining me. So we've got just a few days to go until election day, and hopefully not too much more than that before we get a result. I thought first we'd talk about the two leaders and how they've campaigned. We've seen drama even today on the election campaign. I'm going to ask each of you to choose a moment that you think is significant. It could be Albo's walkout today, if you like, and talk to us about why that moment mattered in this campaign. Paul Kelly, what's your take? What have you found to be the most memorable moment perhaps in that two-leader race this campaign so far?
Well, I think the big moment was Scott Morrison's policy launch last Sunday, when Morrison left the best for last. But I think he may well have left it for too long. The point to make about Morrison is he's campaigned to win a policy debate. He hasn't really campaigned to win an election. Now, that doesn't mean he's finished, because we can anticipate there'll be a final swing towards the Prime Minister in the last 48 hours, and how big that swing will be will determine everything. But there have been two problems with the Morrison campaign. The first problem is that he doesn't establish an emotional connection, a rapport with the Australian public. And this has become very clear as the campaign's gone on. The second problem is that he doesn't really have a policy agenda for the next 3 years. He's campaigned all the time on his record. Now, his record's good. His policy record is very good. But at the end of the day, a campaign is about the future. And it was only last Sunday that he really started talking about the future. So that's the story as far as Morrison's concerned. The point to make about Anthony Albanese is he's stuck by his tactical approach. He's campaigning as Mr. Compassion. He's got a small target agenda. He makes mistake after mistake after mistake about policy, but it doesn't seem to matter, because you get the impression so far that people forgive Anthony Albanese for those mistakes, rather than say, I don't think he's fit to be Prime Minister. So the really fascinating thing about this is, while the public don't have a lot of confidence in Albo, they may well elect him if the polls are to be believed. The question is, can he keep up this tactical approach? Can he keep up the guise all the way to voting day?
Sharri, what's been your take so far?
Look, I think if you separate the polls from the campaign, then a very different picture emerges of the campaign from both Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese. And if you look at it, never before has an election campaign so thoroughly exposed the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of one of the campaigners, of one of the leaders, and obviously that's Anthony Albanese. If the polls weren't, giving this narrative that Labor was ahead, if you were just looking at the day-to-day actions and what the leaders were saying every day and how they were campaigning, no other narrative would emerge other than Albanese has been exposed as potentially a leader who there are questions about his competency to govern the country. He has been outshone by every other frontbencher on his shadow cabinet. He's not across the detail. And yes, Paul's right. He has managed to get by having that empathy that Scott Morrison lacks, by having that emotional connection that Scott Morrison lacks, that, and we saw this in the debate on Channel 7 when he was questioned over what wage rise he would advocate or he would recommend to the Fair Work Commission, and he was unable to nominate a figure. He spoke emotively about it's, only a wage rise of a dollar or whatever it was an hour, or a couple of coffees a day, and how people are doing it tough. So he can build the narrative, and that says something about him as a person. He can connect with people. But in terms of, a prime minister to govern Australia, this campaign has definitely exposed his weaknesses. Scott Morrison's point, as Paul says, his housing policy, I think this is the only policy we've seen the entire campaign that could actually change votes, that might actually sway an undecided voter to support the coalition. Clearly, his pitch, Morrison's pitch in the final week and a half, has been to those undecided voters who he believes at least could determine the outcome of the election. And this policy, whether or not, of course, it has been discussed and canvassed for years. We know Morrison was pushing it when he was Treasurer, but whether or not this was always going to be announced on the final Sunday, we don't really have clarity over that, or whether it was brought on because it was needed. Either way, this policy does have the ability to change votes and to, bring some of those younger voters who are very off the Prime Minister potentially on board.
Simon, Anthony Albanese's been around for a long time, as he keeps reminding us, and Scott Morrison has demonstrated himself to be a very adept campaigner. How have you found the race between the two of them this campaign, and is there a moment that stood out for you?
Look, I'd sum it up like this. Anthony Albanese has had a very poor campaign. He's been caught out. There's no doubt about that. As Paul mentioned, he's mistake after mistake. He's been unconvincing, and he's not been across the detail. Scott Morrison, I think, has had an average campaign if we want to make a comparison to 2019, and this is the fundamental difference. Scott Morrison had to have a great campaign, and this is the problem. I think if I wanted to pick a moment, there's plenty. We could pick every moment that Anthony Albanese has made a gaffe or made a mistake or stuffed up something or other. I think probably April 27, when the ABS announced the inflation figures, caught everybody by surprise. I think that was possibly a game changer. It changed the conversation for the next couple of weeks. It gave Anthony Albanese something to talk about. And so I think, in terms of pivotal moments in the campaign, Paul mentioned yesterday the housing policy that was announced during the campaign launch. That was important, and obviously leading into the final week of the campaign, when people tend to tune in and turn on to an election, was obviously important. But I think that April 27 announcement, or revealing those inflation figures that no one expected, I think was something that really changed the conversation for the couple of weeks after that, sucked a lot of oxygen out of Scott Morrison's campaign, put him on the defensive, and really going into the campaign, obviously all the polls had coalition behind. They had Scott Morrison being behind. He needed to have a very good campaign. He hasn't had a bad campaign, but he really had to have a great campaign. So I think that, that's the way that I would sum it up. We've got 4 days left. He needs to really hit home the message from now until polling day.
Geoff, you've been out on the road during the campaign, like many of our journalists. What's it been like close up? And is there something that's particularly struck you as the defining moment?
Well, I think generally voters are grumpy and they're disillusioned. And I think the original plan, I know I didn't want to use the Macron quote then, but what the original plan was from Morrison's camp was to send off Australians over summer to have a fantastic summer where they rejoin their family and their friends. They have fantastic holidays. They relax. They have no COVID restrictions, no disruptions to their holidays. And I think if that had happened, he was ready to go in March. And we all know what happened. It was the Omicron summer from hell. And I think, they've then have to they had to rejig their strategy. I know he said he was always going to go full term, but that was definitely in play. And when he came back and he delivered this National Press Club mea culpa earlier this year, that was aimed at sort of softening him as a person and to try and apologise for what had happened over that summer around rat tests and soaring cases. He didn't quite get there. So on Friday, just over a week out from the election, he then says, I promise to change my bulldozer leadership style. Now, that's pretty late in the piece, just as this housing policy was late in the piece. And I think the problem for the coalition is that they've tried to retrofit the 2019 campaign, which worked so well for them. And that included having a campaign launched the Sunday before election day. It had a housing policy, and a lot of what they've done around the economy and their ads are sort of framed around that. Now, they don't have as much ammunition this time from Albanese, who's running this really small target, campaign where he just wants to sort of skate through. The pressure has been on them. So I think, a lot of disillusioned voters. We've got 20% of people who have already voted. People just want this thing done and dusted. Now, I think preferences are going to play an enormous role in the final result. I think Labor, if you believe the polls, have the edge. But I think, you see One Nation polling in the teens in Queensland, which is really going to help, sandbag those LNP seats up there. And then obviously you've got the Greens and Teal preferences around the country as well. So I think it's all to play for. I think there's a lot of people who are grumpy, undecided, and looking elsewhere. And in Australia, there's not that many options, but they are going to park their votes. And Morrison's camp is just fingers crossed that, that high preference flow can be similar to 2019.
We'll move on now to talk about some policies, which has been missing in some of the weeks of the campaign. I think we've talked a lot about politics, and there's been a lot of sort of political action, but policy is obviously what voters want politicians to be focusing on and want the media to explore for them. Simon, economic management has been critical, hasn't it? Labor set out wanting this campaign to be about the cost of living, wages, very much hip pocket stuff, and it started right after the budget, of course. Do you think Labor succeeded in kind of ventilating the issue as they wanted to, and how did they go in a policy sense compared to the coalition on this question of economic management?
Well, I think their policies are unconvincing. And in terms of being ventilated, I think that was certainly helped by the Reserve Bank and the inflation figures. That was a sort of manna from heaven for the Labor Party in terms of coming in the first couple of weeks of the campaign. The coalition were streaks ahead of Labor on economic management, have been for some time. This was really the argument that Scott Morrison had to prosecute. I think that there was a view that, when those inflation figures came out, that the fact that it brought the whole campaign back to a focus on economic management was a plus for the coalition. I'm not so sure. I'm not that convinced. Look, I think you sort of have to take into account the fact that people tend to turn on to an election campaign in the first week. The weeks in between, not so much, and they turn to refocus in the last week. And then you also had two weeks there that were taken out by school holidays and Easter. So I'm not sure that people were paying a lot of attention, to be honest, in the middle part of the campaign when a lot of this was being, as you said, ventilated. Labor didn't have to do much. They just had to let it run. But then, as we know, Anthony Albanese sort of shot himself in the foot over wages. So I'm not sure that I don't think that it's benefited either side, to be honest. I think, in terms of economic management, or the argument about economic management and the two competing sort of themes that they're both trying to present, I don't think that I think it's sort of ended up being quite neutral, to be honest. I don't think it's favoured either side.
Paul, China exploded into the conversation early on with the announcement of a Solomon's Beijing security deal. And of course, the war in Ukraine brought issues of national security and defence right to the fore. Peter Dutton said at about the halfway point that Australia needed to start preparing for war, and that's how you prepare for a safer world. How much has national security played into this campaign, do you think, and has this been a policy differential between the parties?
Look, I think national security has been an important issue. It's there all the time in terms of the backdrop to the alarm about China, the war in Ukraine, and then the China-Solomon Islands deal. But I've never thought this was a car-key election. I've never thought that national security would determine what happened. And it's interesting when you look at Anthony Albanese's policy launch. It was all about domestic issues. It was all about the caring society. The whole brief was about compassion. It was about looking after people, better childcare, better healthcare, a better aged care accommodation. And I think that while there's a backdrop in this campaign to national security, the real focus is domestic issues and how people feel. This is an election about grievance. It's an election about how people are feeling, about their hip pocket nerve. It's about the household budgets. And I think it's a mistake to think that the election is going to be won or lost on national security issues. I don't think that's the case at all. National security is a plus for the government. It's sensible for them to talk about it, to focus on it, to highlight the fact that there's a risk there. But of course, they were then embarrassed. Given that one of Scott Morrison's, I think, considerable achievements as a Prime Minister has been the way he stood up to China, the way he stood up to China's economic coercion of Australia. But what happens in the middle of the election campaign? The Chinese secure this tremendous breakthrough with Solomon Islands. And let's not forget that Scott Morrison made a priority of his relationship with the Pacific leaders. So there's no doubt that's an embarrassment for him. Labor, interestingly, went hard on that. Labor elevated that. Labor felt confident enough to say, yes, okay, this event's happened in Solomon Islands. We're now going to run on this hard and exploit it. But I'd finish with my fundamental point here that while there's a national security backdrop, it's domestic issues, cost of living, and how you feel, which is going to determine the election result.
Geoff, this is a slightly left field policy question, but a subscriber's asked that given the fact the electorate doesn't understand the intent of the religious discrimination bill, which of course is what we were all talking about a lot before the election was called, will the coalition drop it? I'm interested in your view too on whether faith and how faith has played into this campaign at presumably a fairly subtle level.
Yeah, so the contrast with 2019 is stark. So in 2019, we didn't have a pandemic. You know, the issues around national security weren't as hot as they are now. So it was Bill Shorten himself that really elevated, religious freedom. He invoked the Prime Minister's faith. He called on the Prime Minister to, say whether he thought, gay kids should go to hell. So that was a real misstep by Labor, and they suffered for that. I think this time around, as Paul said, when you look at the priority, whatever type of polling or survey that newspapers do, lobby groups do, whatever it is, when you look at the top tier issues, it is always health and it's cost of living that is consistently at the top. And you've got national security probably in that mid tier. And right now, this religious freedoms debate, as important it is as to people, it's just not front of mind. So. There's been issues, conversations around transgender issues, and Catherine Deves, and it just, I just don't think Australians want to engage in culture wars right now. They just want to know that their household is secure, that they've got, they can pay for bills, and that they're safe. I mean, that is a very simple, premise, but I just don't think that this religious freedom issue is number one. Plus, it's very complicated. Very few people understand it. That's not to say that in very, very, religious multicultural electorates, that this still isn't a top issue, because it is for a lot of people. But
I was just going to, if you don't mind, I'll throw in something there on just following up from Geoff's conversation there. In 2009, in that last week, it's interesting that a lot of Liberals believe that issue, religious freedoms, the debate that occurred in those last few days, was a reason why a lot of disaffected Conservative voters who may have been parking their votes elsewhere swung hard and swung late back in favour of the coalition. Those same people this time believe that Scott Morrison needed to do something similar for the coalition base to bring them back into the fold. And you brought up Catherine Deves. That issue early on in the campaign was seen as one of those possible issues, a similar sort of issue, a similar values-based issue. And you saw Scott Morrison came out early and backed that review, then pulled back again. Obviously, the controversy surrounding it, but you see what I mean. They were looking for a similar totemic issue that would ignite the base, throw red meat to the base, bring them back into the fold. They were hoping to do that again this time around.
Sharri, one of several issues that you've been writing about during the campaign has been the teal independents, the rise of so-called Climate 200 linked independents who are running in a whole bunch of pretty affluent seats against generally Liberal moderates. I'm interested in your take on both their policy positions and the impact that they're having or they have had on the election. The three sort of big policy planks seem to be women's rights, a federal integrity commission, and climate action in varying degrees. So firstly, on that question of policy, how much have they been able to kind of really get people thinking about policy, do you think?
Look, I think the first thing I'd say about the Teals is that if you look at the top 14 seats that the coalition is most vulnerable in, so the top 14 seats that the coalition is most at risk of losing this election, a good 5 of them are to the independents. So, the independents are almost emerging as great a threat to some of the Liberal Party seats as the Labor Party. And I think this could end up being kind of a defining moment in the election outcome, depending how close it ends up being between the two parties. It's fascinating that Malcolm Turnbull has urged, for example, people to support the Teal independents, even if he hasn't said it that directly, because the Liberal Party has become too conservative. But if you say they all win, and I don't think they will, but say all of the independents that have the best chance of winning win, you end up with a Liberal Party that is even more conservative than it is now. If Josh Frydenberg loses Kooyong, and I don't think he will, but if he did, again, the opposition leader and the government loses the election, then the opposition leader would be Peter Dutton, again, taking the Liberal Party in a more conservative direction. Whereas if Josh won his seat and the government lost the election, he would clearly be a contender for that leadership and would present a more moderate Liberal Party. So, voters, I think, misunderstand, and Paul Kelly wrote the most brilliant piece on the independents that anybody has written a couple of weeks ago. Like everything that Paul Kelly writes is more brilliant than anyone else has written, but this particular piece was brilliant because voters think that they're voting for just a safe, nice woman, because most of them are female, who's pro climate change, cares about integrity, cares about the environment. They don't realise, and I live in Wentworth, so I'm in one of the seats where Allegra Spender is capturing the attention of the electorate and capturing the mood, and she's a very fashionable candidate and people want to say that they're supporting her. But they don't realise that the outcome of putting more independents in Parliament does have consequences. It would ultimately present a weaker government could have a result of having a weaker government instead of having a stronger majority governing party. Not to mention that, a point John Howard makes, which is that in effect, you're voting for Labor because the seats where the independents are running are against Liberal MPs. So if they win, that's removing a seat from the coalition and more likely to deliver government to Labor. Of course, it's also drawing resources. And just a point to make about Josh Frydenberg, there's been a lot of criticism of him within the Liberal Party because he's been tied down to his seat and he hasn't been campaigning around the country as much as you would expect a deputy leader to be contributing and helping other members in marginal seats. He's been spending a lot of time defending Kooyong, not to mention the resources that go with that. So I think that's an interesting point, and that's opened up a bit of division in the Liberal Party, a bit of animosity towards Josh Frydenberg that wasn't really there before, certainly not as prominent.
Paul, I've got another question from the audience. Dave is asking about Palmer's preferences this time around. We've all seen the big yellow ads again in the newspapers and heard them on the radio. What's your sense of the level to which what used to be called the pups are having an effect on this campaign?
Well, I think this will be probably another problem for the government, because I think that the government won't get the same degree of preference flows to it that it got in 2019 from Pauline Hanson's One Nation and from the Palmer Party. And clearly, these parties are going to take primary votes from both parties, but they'll take primary votes from the coalition, and I don't think they'll return them to the same extent that they did in 2019. So I think in that sense, the government may be worse off. That's what I'd say about that particular question. I would like briefly to say something about the discussion we've just had, though, about Scott Morrison, because I think one of the problems in this campaign is that it's not a campaign about policy. It's a campaign about character. Now, Morrison's mistake in the campaign and for the 12 or 18 months before the campaign is that he tends to respond to character attacks with policy responses. Well, you can't do that. That doesn't work. A policy answer doesn't respond to an attack on character. You've got to respond in terms of character. And Morrison hasn't done this. He hasn't defined his character sufficiently strongly over the last couple of years. Now, I don't agree with a lot of the populist conservative commentators who want Morrison to go a long way to the right. But there are two issues I've identified where I think he should have done a lot more, and they are opposition to identity politics. I mean, he rejects identity politics. He feels very strongly about it, but he wouldn't campaign against it. I think this has been a major mistake because that would have been popular with the public and it would have been popular with the coalition base. The other issue is school curriculum. Now, this is a defining issue, again, in terms of values and culture. The government has strong views on this. I think the government should have campaigned on school curriculum. Once again, I think it could have got a popular support for this, but the Prime Minister didn't venture onto either of these playing fields, identity politics or school curriculum, in the last little while. The final point I'd make about this, and I think this is an extraordinary failure on the part of the Prime Minister, is the Anti-Corruption Commission. Now, this was always going to be an issue, and essentially what the government did was the government didn't want to fight on this. It went through this tokenistic approach of devising a bill, but it never fought for its bill, it never introduced its bill, and it never partook in the debate against Labor and the Greens. Now, this was a major mistake because if you don't engage in debates, you lose that debate and you lose that issue. The government should have introduced this bill a year ago. It should have fought for it. It should not have backed down and accepted Labor's amendments. But that means it would be able to say, this is our Integrity Commission model. We want justice. We oppose show trials. We want procedural fairness. We want an integrity system that works. It should have argued that for the previous 12 or 18 months, so it had a position in the campaign. It's had no position in the campaign at all. And in the rich, better off seats where this is an issue, it's damaged Morrison significantly.
Simon, I can see you nodding there as well.
Well, I completely agree with Paul, but I think this is interesting. And following from Sharri's remarks about the Teals, I know this may sound weird, but bear with me. That even though those people that may be flirting with voting for UAP or may vote for UAP or saying they'll vote for UAP, they have something in common with those that are backing the Teals, and it goes to this issue of the Integrity Commission. Not that UAP supporters support an Integrity Commission, but it goes to the same feeling. The politics is now being defined by outsiders, and that view is that Canberra is corrupt. It's a similar theme, and it's drawing votes from both sides, from both extremes, from the left and the right.
It's drain the swamp, isn't it? It's that sentiment. Again, I mean, I hear the Integrity Commission being discussed in Vox Pops, on Talkback a lot. It does seem to be coming from both ends of that spectrum, from the Teals and from Pauline Hanson.
Yeah, well, as I said, from both sides of politics, from both ends of the spectrum, if you like.
Could I just respond to something else Paul Kelly said? Paul spoke about Scott Morrison not defending or defining his own character. So he has been successfully defined by Anthony Albanese, in my view, ever since the bushfires. But I think it wasn't just that was a failing. It was that he didn't return fire and negatively define Albanese's character. And there's a lot of material to work with. Albanese has come from a radical left socialist faction of the Labor Party. There is plenty of material to work with there over the years, not to mention, his more recent bungles and issues of incompetence. But it's only in this campaign where we've seen Morrison directly target and attack Albanese, or at least anything that has remotely started to cut through. So I think not only was it a failure to define himself, he let himself be defined as Scotty from marketing, and he doesn't hold a hose. That Labor campaign was very successful, and he has not managed to define Albanese, in a similar negative light. And so that's why this has turned into mostly a referendum on character, on Scott Morrison's character, although now, of course, there are some policy differences very late in the campaign.
Geoff, we've got a couple more questions from readers from the audience that I wanted to get your feeling on. There's two. Sarah's asked, how good and reliable are the polling numbers as we get closer to the election day? And this is slightly related. Marilyn's asked, with so many pre-poll and postal votes, will we even get a result on election night?
Well, given Simon is our news poll expert, I might flick it over to him.
Is that a hospital?
No, I think he'll want to weigh in, so it's all
Simon is the one on.
Well, before we do that, though, I just wanted to go back to Paul's point on the Integrity Commission, and I do agree with him wholeheartedly. And I think that the practical reality of it that we've seen play out, especially in the last 12 months or so, was that Scott Morrison was struggling to keep his small majority intact. I mean, he was trying to bring the Nats and the Conservatives along on net zero. He had other Conservatives threatening to quit over vaccine mandates. And I just think he just didn't want the fight. And I think Paul's right. He needed to have that fight, even though people were threatening to cross the floor. You can't always, manage that issue to a point where you think, oh, that's okay, people will forget about it. It's not how it works.
Can I add one thing to the Integrity Commission, though? In New South Wales, after the forced resignation of Gladys Berejiklian as a result of ICAC, there was such a strong public sentiment against the Corruption Commission. She was such a popular premier who had led the state through the pandemic. And everyday people who aren't engaged in politics were deeply upset about how she was treated by the Integrity Commission, by ICAC. And we know there have been major problems with ICAC. I spent a year myself reporting on it and investigating it back in 2015. And as a result, ICAC was overhauled slightly, but not enough. They put in 3 commissioners instead of 1, etc. Very corrupt processes within ICAC, very problematic processes that are so far from a system of justice, and about half of the people they investigate or whose lives they ruin end up having adverse findings against them, and the other half are perfectly innocent. That is not an adequate system of justice or investigating corruption. It's corrupt itself, in my opinion. The point is that after the way Gladys Berejiklian was treated, this is the only time in history where Dominic Perrottet, as New South Wales Premier, could have come out. He would have had the political capital to say, we are going to change the way that ICAC operates. He knew it was problematic. Everyone knows it's problematic. He had previously expressed concerns about how ICAC operates. Matt Keane, had extreme concerns about how ICAC operates, but they didn't have the courage to do it. Scott Morrison is the only person who, because he knew it was the right thing, he did have the courage to come out and speak out against ICAC and the way Gladys Berejiklian was treated, even though he hates Gladys Berejiklian and she hates him. So, I think there's something to be said for that. He should have had the fight. He should have had the debate. He should have introduced the legislation. I think it's a terrible pity that the New South Wales Premier didn't have the courage to take it on, knowing better than anyone it's terrible failings.
Simon, you're in the hot seat on the polls.
Yeah, I thought I was going to get away with it then. Thought I was going to get away with it. Look, the thing about the polls, and Paul's been around polls longer than I have too, I'm sure he'll agree, they are a snapshot in time. They're not a predictor of outcomes. They are a particular view of voting intention at the time. I have all confidence in our polls, in News Poll at least. There's a lot of polls going around. I mean, the one thing I will say, be careful of candidate-funded polls that you seem to be throwing up every day. We don't do robocalls anymore for obvious reasons. They're unreliable, and that's been the case for some time. Methodology has changed over the years. 2019, obviously there are issues around there. We've changed methodology. I've got every confidence in the polls, in our polling at least, that it reflects a particular view at the time. And the polls at the moment, I don't think anyone would disagree, reveal that at the moment the coalition is struggling and Scott Morrison is struggling. I don't think there's anything controversial in those polls. So I don't buy the argument there's a problem with the polls at the moment, other than our poll is right and the other ones are probably unreliable.
Paul, what do you think?
Well, we saw that there was a problem with the polls of the 2019 election. Most of the polls got the election wrong. And since then, I know there's been a big effort on the part of the polling organisations to review their methods, to look at their methodology. There were a lot of problems here in terms of technology, landlines, mobile phones, all sorts of built-in biases. And I think an effort has been made to correct that. Certainly News Poll, over many, many years, has got the most impressive record. There's no question about that at all. And I guess the point I'd make here is that the big test for the polls will come next weekend.
Well, the other point to add to that is the last 3 state elections, News Polls speak completely accurately.
That's correct.
On that question, I'm coming back to you, Geoff. You're not dodging it. On that question of the many pre-polls and postals, a sort of slightly related question is, given that we're seeing this race down to the wire in WA and seats still seem to be very much in play, are we all going to have a very late night on Saturday night?
I don't have a crystal ball. And I do think vote's going to fragment across the country. I don't think you're going to get uniform swings. Neither leader are popular at this point. And the issues that matter to people change, whether you're in North Queensland, Central Queensland, Northern New South Wales, South Coast. So, look, I know the AEC's put a lot in place. They were preparing for a pandemic election. Tom Rogers is a pretty good operator. So I think they've put things in place to try and get this counting done as quickly as they can. It'll be better than some of the state elections that we saw during the height of the pandemic. So, look, I think, if you're going to have a clear result, you should see that on Saturday night. But, if things, as you say, whether it's West Australia or Queensland or Tassie, if these seats are close, well, this could, stretch out over a couple of days.
Simon, last week on The Front, we talked about the nationwide seat-by-seat poll that we had, and you made the point in that episode that that Queensland seemed to be the state that was sticking with the government perhaps more than the others at that point. What's going on in Queensland? What's happening there? What's different?
Well, that's the multi-regression post-stratification poll that you're talking about.
Still don't know what that means.
The MRP. Look, Queensland's. I mean, this has been the case for a number of years now. All of our polling has shown that Queensland remains strong for Scott Morrison and the coalition. That hasn't changed. The polls indicate that hasn't changed. Queenslanders certainly didn't like Bill Shorten. I don't think they like Anthony Albanese anymore. They don't trust Labor on some of the key issues that are relevant to a lot of Queenslanders. Of course, Queensland is a state with urban and regional areas too, and there are issues in metropolitan Brisbane. I think Brisbane, the seat of Brisbane, actually was one seat that the MRP picked that would fall to Labor. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that they'll lose a seat or two in Queensland, but largely compared to the other states, Queensland is sticking with the coalition, with the LNP at least, and Scott Morrison.
Believe it or not, we're nearly out of time. I wanted to come to Paul finally. Paul, when we spoke a few days ago, you described Kooyong as the most important seat in the nation. I think a lot of people are watching that seat very closely. Sharri spoke about it a little earlier. Why is Kooyong so important? And I'm loath to ask you to make a prediction, but what do you think is going to happen?
Kooyong is critical in historical terms and in terms of what it represents at this election. So what we see with the independents is that this is a political movement on the centre-left, and its purpose is to politically decapitate the Liberal Party. That's what its purpose is. John Howard has nailed this, and he's nailed it very effectively. This is a political movement running only against coalition candidates, Liberal candidates, and the effect of this, of course, is to diminish Liberal seats. The effect is to weaken the Liberal Party. But beyond that, clearly what we're seeing here is a fundamental change in the economic and cultural foundations of the Liberal Party. And the big question is, at this election, not just who wins, which is the main question, but what does it mean for the Liberal Party, and whether the party of Menzies is going to be damaged in the most significant way that we haven't really seen since its formation. So Kooyong becomes a test of all that. Kooyong is particularly important, of course, because it's Menzies' seat. It's now the seat held by the Treasurer, by the Deputy Leader of the party, by a possible future leader of the party. And so it's going to be an extraordinary result if a left-wing independent, and Dr. Ryan running against Josh Frydenberg, we saw from the debate, is very much a left-wing candidate. Many of her attitudes seem to be aligned with the Greens. So essentially what we're looking at here is a left-wing pro-green candidate dressed up as some sort of disaffected Liberal seeking to depose the deputy leader of the Liberal Party and the Treasurer. You could hardly get a more significant contest, or a contest that might have significance in terms of the future. I hope Josh Frydenberg holds this seat. I really want him to hold the seat. He deserves to hold the seat. He's been a very good local member for Kooyong. He's been a very successful treasurer during an exacting period of challenge for this country. He's done a tremendous job under very difficult circumstances. And I think if he was to lose his seat and be removed from the Parliament, that would be a disappointing result and a very disappointing commentary on the judgment of people in Kooyong. My final point is about the independents. The greatest single fraud we see in this election campaign is the independents saying that a minority parliament will be a great thing for Australia. Now, we know Simon Holmes à Court is campaigning for a minority parliament. He wants a hung parliament. He says this will be good for the country. You know what that means? This is all about power for the independents. The reason they think it's a great thing for the country is because it empowers them. It empowers them on the crossbench. They decide who governs Australia. They have to be consulted on all legislation. And of course, if there's no minority parliament, if it's a majority government, they have no power. So let's not kid ourselves. All this debate about a minority government is really about a quest for power by the independents.
That's all we have time for tonight. Thank you to Paul, Simon, Sharri and Geoff for joining us and for sharing your insights. Thank you also to our subscribers for spending the evening with us. We really appreciate your continued support. Remember to keep an eye out on the australianplus.com.au for where you can get more of our more out of your subscription with exclusive offers, competitions and other member benefits. And don't forget, you can join me every weekday for The Front, giving you behind the scenes insights into the day's headlines. You can listen wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll be having special Saturday and Sunday episodes this weekend. Thank you for joining us. Good night.